that as well, I think, is a fallacy. You don't have to have read all those names to be a writer. Although I'll say, to begin with, that a writer learns his craft reading the others. So if he's influenced by almost anybody he reads, good or bad, this influence will take the form of learning from another writer. Of course, if you think of influence in terms of imitating another writer, well, that doesn't interest me, at least. But if you take it as learning from other writers, well, I can think of a large number of writers who taught me things, different things, especially when I was young. Now, I'll come back to the former proposition, and I'll say you don't have to have read certain names just because those who read you or review your book have read them. Of course, the contrary may be true as well. I may have read, as an author, I may have read people you've never read. For a very good reason. I will have read lots of Turkish writers, and if they haven't been translated into English, which is the case, as we know, you'll never know about them. So we're limited, we're terribly limited by our readings. And in all our contacts and exchanges, we're still being limited by our readings. So we must be careful about those things. Now, speaking about Kafka, I will say two things. I think on Kafka, I read him when I was about 22 years old. I read him in French and later in English. I think I read America in English. But all these other books in French. Now, that of course is having read him in translation, and I cannot speak of Kafka as a writer in German. I don't know how he wrote in German, but what is Kafka doing in all this? Again, I'll come back to our readings. I'll say that when we speak of Kafka, we speak most of the time of what is left in us, in our minds, of an earlier reading of Kafka. That is general atmosphere, perhaps. Because we know that certain things that we see in Kafka we might find in much earlier writers, but there's a pronounced difference between them and Kafka. What is this difference? I think the structure of his sentences, the way he puts his world into those simple and almost clumsy sentences. Bernard Kruthuisen, in one of his prefaces to translation into French, speaks of the blinding clarity of dreams. The blinding clarity of dreams, I found that very strange to say when I was 20, yes, when I was 20. But Karasu'nun explains very well what he means by this blinding clarity of dreams. Dreams, he says, although blurred, are extremely limited in their shapes. All the shapes are extremely limited. And even in those blurry things you see, you recognize what thing. You recognize things that have a single meaning, funnily enough. But he was not speaking of psychoanalysis, that's completely different. But in what he said about Kafka, he was trying to convey this strange clarity within a general atmosphere of ambiguity. The whole thing is ambiguous, but the whole thing is so clear because of the sentences. Well, I'll say that my sentences are not structured in that way, but that's about myself. Let's go back to Kafka. What I think we share, what I think we have in common with him, is this sense of fear, this sense of disquiet about the world. I know nothing of his world. I try to imagine it, but what I know as a reader his book is that that fear, that comes out of nothing and is there gripping at you, to the end. We don't know a thing about the whys and hows, whatever is happening. Just wake up one morning and find yourself turned into a bug, and that's that. Finally, that bug understands the human mind, while the human beings, although they know who he is, consider him a bug, just a bug. Well, this is terrifying. This, I think, we have in common. I have a feeling of that sort of.
Other question.
Fear.
Have you been asked the same question in Turkey, or this is just the impression of the American readers that you have been under influence of the Kafka? I read your previous novel. I haven't read this one yet, but I didn't see any similarity.
Exactly. I mean, about this novel, people speak easily with Kafka. I think it's written too easily. Yes, sir, you were.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I think you're quite right that what's happened, listening to your Turkish in the beginning, you've been translated into the voice of Kafka in English. Your translator has taken those abrupt and tentative sentences that we associate with the Kafka we know, the English Kafka, and used that voice here. And maybe that's why so many American readers have led to Kafka, because of the voice we hear in this book, the English voice.
Well, I'll say that in this book, my sentences sometimes are very short, very direct. But again, it's within my own way of saying things. Kafka is much more straightforward than I am. I mean, that's trying to be, as much a reader as I can be of myself. Because you have to learn to be a reader of yourself if you write. If you like what you write, just because you wrote it, written it, and it's not good. You have to learn to be a critical reader of yourself. If you learn how to be that kind of reader, it's better for the author. Much better. Which novel?
I don't remember its name now, but it's one of your first novels. You also tell a story under each page with the footnotes. It looks like a chase. You are talking about like a chase, but actually you are narrating a love story.
Yes. 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 Yeah. It gets disappear. I mean, that's terribly difficult to translate into English. Yes. Well, perhaps some readers would find Kafka in one or two of those things, perhaps. I don't know.
So may I ask its name? I couldn't remember the name of it.
Göçmüş Kediler Bahçesi. Göçmüş Kediler Bahçesi.
I was particularly taken by very visual, and as we've been talking, I spent a lot of time thinking about film. Is this characteristic of your other writings too, a strong visual sense?
I think it is. Now, a book that preceded mine, which is a collection of very long texts, very experimental. Well, in those texts, non-existent paintings and photographs come up all the time. I mean, in most texts you find description of a painting or a photograph, which doesn't exist. For some reason, I mean, those texts were especially visual. The book which followed again was thought to be an almost written screenplay. Almost written, of course it wasn't. I think that people will have some trouble turning it into a screenplay.
But this one we could work. We've got the headgear for the night workers. We've got the square bread.
Oh,
Yes.
Or on the other hand, it's a book that's very much about writing novels too. It seems as if it's a story and then it's meditation on telling the story at the same time.
well, I've done it, for the past 15 years or so. Why? Because, I mean, for different reasons, but one of them is to attract the reader's attention on the act of writing. I think that people got used to read, very, very easily, very superficially, and pulling them from time to time, attracting their attention to the act of writing. Maybe a way of influencing the reading itself.
I think it very much succeeds in that way because as I was reading it, I would become engaged in the story, and then a section would pull me away from the story and say, no, remember the frame. This is literature. This is not reality. And so I'd have to change my perspective and see it again.
This is what others have done as well. On the stage, or somewhere else.
But it sounds a lot like Brecht's theory.
Well, not in writing novels, I think.
No.
Mind you, I mean, I don't think I participate as the author, but as the writer who's there. I've done that sort of thing in another text. I mean, as the author himself, as the author himself. Those are too experimental to be translated ever. It's possible to translate those texts. Yes.
Mr. Karasu, I was a child in late 70s, and Turkey was in a political chaos at that time. So later, when I had the chance to take a look at your book, novel, I strongly, overwhelmingly thought about that period. Is that period a source for imagery for this book?
A source, certainly a source. I underline that one, a source. Because, I mean, one source. Because it's quite different from anything that might have happened then. But let me tell you that what you remember follows the writing of the book. The writing of the book followed another period that you don't remember, I guess. You cannot remember that one. You're too young for that. Anyway, yes, it's one source of my imagery, as you say. I like your imagery.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Yes. You mentioned using yourself as an author to get back to sources again of influences. Have you read Kundera?
Yes, I read him a few years ago.
In Turkish? I always translate Turkish.
In French. He was translated into Turkish several years ago, but I read it in French. And then I read a book of essays, again in French. And I was surprised that we had many things in common, But I speak of the thinking on fiction. And it was really a surprise because that was, say, 6-7 years ago. I'm too old to
Well, I was curious because this is the first chance I've had something.
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to say. You see, I mean, your readings, and that one is very fresh in your mind right now. That, again, is very important, You may have read things 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or perhaps even. Well, with me it's important, because I think with certain readings that was 50-odd years ago. It's not exactly the same experience. Yes?
Well, just something about what you're saying on trying to determine influences. And it seems to me that a reader instinctively makes a comparison in order to relate something that's unfamiliar something that's familiar, particularly if they've read the work fairly recently.
Particularly?
Particularly if they've read the work fairly recently.
Yes.
So someone reading your work would think, perhaps Kafka, it's well known, he's obviously a well-read writer. And it's a way the reader relates something which seems unfamiliar to something familiar that he knows. And it's an instinct, I think it's an instinctive human reaction.
Absolutely.
When it comes down to determining influence versus imitation, and I think you made that distinction, which is very important, a second-rate writer, you can very quickly determine imitation. He's often lifted whole portions, or his themes has come from a better writer. But in most instances, influence or inspiration are really hard echoes to trace. They're nuanced. There's a possible image here or there. And some of it may just be coincidence as well. And I always
know that.
Yeah, I always draw a distinction between imitating and influencing. Anything truly worthwhile is not an imitation. It's the artist's own creation. It's a series of different influences, nuances he may have assimilated over a long period, but the work is distinctly his own. In the end, it has to be filtered through that author's, or in the case of the visual arts, through that artist's own interpretation.
Well, you help me very much, because
that's how I would express it.
That's one thing I wanted to say. I mean, when we meet someone or a text, for the first time, what we see, whether it's right or wrong, is what we think we find familiar, and perhaps a little later we find that this familiarity was wrong, and then we start seeing the differences, and we start being, disturbed by what seems to be very awkward to us. We have to, cross that stage as well. But influence, as I said, it's there from the very beginning. You read...
Very indefinite.
Exactly. You read people you like, you read people you don't like, and you're warned against certain things, and you like certain other things. And again, coincidence. I found that.
Question about the role of the writer today. The world seems to be in pretty rough shape around the world. Situations in different countries. Kundera says in one of his essays, the novel is one of the few hopes to save the world. That's a very great, almost romantic claim for fiction. Do you share Kundera's mission for prose?
I'm not that optimistic and that hopeful. No, but it's one of the instruments that might help, there are countries and cultures which live in a continuous narration of things, but are completely unaware of the role of fiction. There are other cultures and other people who are very much interested in reading fiction. Novels sell like hotcakes. But still, what do they read? The world is in a pretty bad shape, you're quite right, but has it been really better at any other time? It's only that we are aware of the bad shapes, or we aren't. There's always hunger, there's always killing, there's always oppression, there's always crime, there's always poverty. Sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not. what would you say? I would know. But the novel might help. I don't think there are more novels written right now than they were written 300 years ago. It's just that we have forgotten about the bulk of novels written in those days. We remember only 3 or 4 names. People in 100 years will remember perhaps only 20 names. And in 200 or 300 years, God knows how many names they will remember from our time. There seems to be an inflation of fiction, of all sorts of fiction. I think there were. How do I know about that? Well, sometimes in footnotes and things, you find interesting information. Lots of books that have been written of all sorts, novels. Great success that were forgotten 30, 40 years later. Let's not be very hopeful about things like that, but I think it may help. Otherwise, why should I try to write? But there's one thing I want to say in this context. Writing is not just writing stories. It's writing in a language. It's not just telling stories. It's writing in a language. It's shaping a language. It's molding it. And that we do forget most of the time. We should not. For Turkish, to me at least, this is a mission. In New York, I said I owe myself to Turkish. That's why I'll never write in any other language. But that's important.
Do you give a message to the readers through your stories?
Well, good or bad, right or wrong, there's always a message. As long as there is one to read it, you see. I mean, a message is
The
not
problem
worth.
message is very vague in your stories. Maybe this is why
What
you give
are
impression
you?
that they...
What are you looking for? Now, this is
So you
the
think
question I will ask you, as the author. What are you looking for?
So
If you're
everybody
looking
should
for a
make their
certain
own
message,
interpretation?
provided it's supported by the text itself.
Well, some of what you're saying hits me very strongly. I'm a classicist. I read Greek and Latin. And what you say about writing only in Turkish and more than a message, I appreciate when I think of how the Romans have to create a literature based on what the Greeks have written. There's a lot more than telling a message in another language. You shape the language. You bring it to levels that it's never had before in a written form, and especially in poetry in an oral form.
Exactly.
And the reason why 20 novels may last 200 years from now, or be remembered 200, 300, 400 years from now, a Homer in the case of Greece, is that it's more than the message. It's the beauty of the language. It's the elegance of shaping it. It's bringing the language to its full potential, and that's what great authors do.
Thank you.
And you cannot change that. You can't appreciate it in translation, and I know very, very much what you say. I constantly tell my students, you cannot understand a literature unless you really read it in the original language and see what the author's trying to attain, not only with a message, but with all the nuances and the beauty of the language, and in many ways, taking that language beyond the limits of where it started.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
then leaving it to posterity for future writers to take it from those limits and move on and be part of that literary tradition.
That's what makes a language possible.
And it
the
also
language
ensures the enduring of those texts to later generations to go back to them.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, I say two things to my students. Literature is the memory of the
Mhm.
language. And that's all. I mean, it's just the memory of a language. And then a language does not exist by itself. It exists only in what texts have been materialized in that language. And unfortunately, only written texts when there's more time than human memory can keep account of. So there we are. Thank you. Thank you very much.
There's a question there. Yes.
You know that Turkish language has gone through tremendous change in the past 70 years. And things which were written 70 years ago, we really have to put down this week. What kind of concerns do you have in terms of change, rapid change in Turkish language, so that, you know, the regular, say, half a century from now, how would they understand your writing?
Now, this is a problem for the Turkish people. Now, let's try to convey it to the non-Turkish here. To begin with, I don't think that the Turkish language underwent such a rapid change in the past 70 years, for a very good reason. Part of this change was going back into Turkish. And what I said a moment ago, and what
Kenneth Harl was my name.
Kenneth
Harl, my last name.
What you said, you see, is a very clear statement of what can be said about it. You see, part of this change, and a very important part of this change, was going back to the sources. That is, to the very first sources, such as Yunus Emre or Dede Korkut. And this means the 12th, 13th century. So there we are, going back. And some of it was the creation of new terms for the new concepts and the changing world. Now, if anything, this change never occurred in Turkish. It occurred in the written Turkish of the very, very, how should I say, the very noble intellectuals. Now, I have nothing against them, don't misunderstand me, but the folk tradition was there all the time, from the 13th to the 20th. They sometimes imitated the palace poets, sometimes. But the tradition went on, and what they wrote and what they composed was Turkish, plain Turkish. The historians wrote Turkish until the 15th century. Later on they began to write in Osmanlı. There were very great poets who wrote Osmanlı from the 16th to the 18th, beginning with Baki and ending with Sheikh Galip. That's all right. But if the educated people thought that the only way of expressing themselves in writing was to write that particularly difficult language, which was not Turkish, Well, that's nobody's fault. Now, beginning with the 50s in the 19th century, people thought of writing in a language that would be understood by the majority of the readers. And they started simplifying their language. And Halit Ziya, who is one of the greatest among the moderns, simplified his books 30 years or 35 years after the first publication. So he felt that need. Why? Because that language was no longer used, even by the educated, to the extent it was, say, 200 years ago. So we must be very careful in stating that there was a very rapid change in Turkish. In some circles, perhaps, but not in Turkish. Not in Turkish. But you see, I mean, this is a very Turkish controversy.
Perhaps we can move to the reception. Yes, and join.